So I'm very pleased to have Sharad Bhargava with us today for our interview process. Sharad, thank you very much for participating and welcome.
Thank you.
Now, we typically begin the interviews with some background questions for context. We ask everybody the same questions. So we'll start off by asking you where your parents were born.
My parents were born in India. They immigrated to Canada from India.
Okay. And where were you born?
I was born in India as well, in Mumbai.
Okay. And where did you receive your education? Your elementary, secondary, and any post-secondary?
Elementary school education was in India. My secondary high school I finished in Montreal, and I did engineering at McGill University here in Montreal.
Okay, very good. And what is your occupation, or were your occupations?
I'm an engineer.
Very good. And where do you live now?
I live in the West Island in Dollar des Ormeaux.
Okay, very good. So now we're going to get to what I like to call the meat of the matter. And these are questions concerning your experience living in Quebec today. And we'll start off by asking you, what in your mind is the best thing about living in Quebec today?
I think Quebec, and for that matter, Canada, both Canada and Quebec are some of the best places in the world to live in. We have a clean environment. We have a relatively peaceful political structure. We have good social programs, high standard of living, and compared to many other places in the world, it's a very good place. I am grateful to be living in Canada.
Very good. Now, the next question, I'm going to preface it by explaining something that a lot of people have found this question difficult. I certainly, if it was posed to me as it is, I would find it difficult, but I encourage you to respond to the question as posed. However, you're free to elaborate on your response as much as you'd like. So having said that, I'll ask the question. Describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word.
Trouble.
Okay. Where do you feel most at home in Quebec? For example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
Living in the West Island, like I've been in the West Island for many years. My schools were here. My workplace was close to here. So basically West Island. Okay.
And the next question, again, I'm going to preface it by explaining something. A lot of people have asked me about this second part of the question, specifically about the official definition in Quebec. And they ask me, what do you mean by official definition? And what I mean is what you perceive to be the official definition of Quebec, whether it's something that you've seen in the media, whether it's the Quebec government's official definition, or the Canadian government's official definition, or what your peers perceive to be the official definition. So having said that, I'll ask the two-part question. How would you define a Quebecer? And do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
I would define a Quebecer as any person living in Quebec. So yes, I think the definition includes me, but there are nationalist elements in Quebec who want to exclude minority communities.
Okay, very good. Now, has your sense of identity as a Quebecer changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
I'm concerned about the increasing restrictions put on minority rights in Quebec. They're by successive governments. So the Quebec government, in my opinion, has institutionalized racism against linguistic and ethnic and religious minorities by enacting laws 21, 40, and 96. So I feel more excluded in Quebec as time goes on.
Okay. And what are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec?
The social conflict and the continued restriction of minority rights in Quebec.
Okay. Now, the questions I've sent you as question 7 I've recently parsed that question to be a more fair question. So it's really asking the same question, but the wording is slightly different. So I'm going to ask it. In recent years, some members of Quebec's Francophone majority have identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. Which of these concerns do you share and support, and which of these concerns make you feel excluded or targeted?
So I share the concern of protecting the French language. I do think it can be done in ways that do not exclude minorities and their rights. And multiculturalism and diversity are being pushed aside. And I'm very concerned with that and the type of society you build in the future.
Okay. And what is the biggest problem facing Quebec today, and how, in your mind, do you feel it could be resolved?
I really see three big problems facing Quebec today. The first one is social discord and conflict. And this is happening because the government is excluding or restricting minority rights for linguistic, ethnic, and religious communities and indigenous communities. And this can be fixed by having a more inclusive government that that cares about all the communities living in Quebec. The second big problem I see is an aging population and a shortage of workers. This is not being helped by the Quebec government's laws that make people feel excluded. A lot of young people will potentially leave Quebec, and Quebec needs to embrace diversity and be open to immigration. The third big problem I see facing Quebec today is climate change. And this will require a restructuring of Quebec society. We will need to build a circular economy and find a way to reduce the carbon footprint of many people. So basically for Quebec, or for Canada, what this will entail is all levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal working together and addressing this problem.
Okay. Now we're going to just pause for a second, and I'm going to preface the next question by asking you if you've had an opportunity to see the documentary What We Choose to Remember by Guy Rogers.
No.
Okay. In that documentary, the reason I'm prefacing the question, he used a very effective visual tool, which was a show of fingers. But with his blessing, I'm going to use the same tool in this next question. So I would like you to indicate by a show of fingers on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being weakest, 10 being strongest, how strongly do you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges?
5.
Very good. And Sharad, I'll give you one last opportunity to say anything you like about your sense of identity or belonging in Quebec.
Okay. So I think there are fundamental issues in Canada, and one of that need to be addressed. And I'll read this because I wrote it. So one of them is that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Official Languages Act are based on a Eurocentric view of Canada, as they enshrine English and French as the official languages of Canada. So they ignore the existence of over 70 distinct Aboriginal languages, which were there in the territories that became Canada. And they do not acknowledge and it does not acknowledge the contribution of Aboriginal peoples and other communities in Canada. So this is, to me, one of the big problems in Canada. And the second one is in the Canadian Constitution, the notwithstanding clause, which allows provinces to override basic human rights. So going forward in the future, I don't know if it'll be possible, but I would like to see these two things changed so everyone can have a better future in Canada.
Okay, well, Sharad, I want to thank you very much for participating in the project. And I'm going to stop the recording now, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of things offline here that you